This concludes tonight's press conference. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everyone.
That was U.S. President Joe Biden speaking at a podium. You see that the press corps still had plenty of questions left following up after he took all the questions from the press. The things he said, he started with the importance of NATO to the U.S., saying attack on one of us and is an attack on all of us. America cannot retreat from the world. It must lead the world. So really reiterating U.S.'s role to the international community. He went on to remind the people present and all the Americans watching at home about all of the accomplishments of his presidency of the last 4 years. He said that just this morning he got a great economic report. But of course, much of that press conference was about defending his record and his ability to run for president now against so much criticism that has stemmed after his debate with Donald Trump. And some of the other gaffes he has made, including the one this morning where instead of referring to Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, he referred to him as Vladimir Putin. That was not the only gaffe that happened today. But to bring us up to speed, I want to bring in journalist Nick Harper. Nick, you have been listening in along with us. You're joining us again. What stood out for you?
Well, look, this was a much longer press conference than I think any of us thought it was going to be. It clocked in at almost 1 hour. He spoke to 10 reporters who had several questions for him each. On the whole, this was a forceful, strong performance, certainly much better than 2 weeks ago. He perhaps had set the bar incredibly low off the back of that debate performance, and whatever he did tonight was going to be an improvement on that. I mean, he did say he is determined on running. He said it's important to allay fears, to do press conferences like this. But he did say, no matter what I do, no one is ever going to be satisfied. He faced some incredibly brutal questions about his legacy, about staying in the race and whether it was damaging for America's standing in the world, whether he was up to the rigours of the job, to which he replied, I've just got to pace myself a little bit more. You mentioned gaffes. Of course, that was something that everyone was looking out for. And one of those was highlighted at the very end of that press conference, where earlier he was asked a question whether he thought Vice President Kamala Harris would be able to beat Donald Trump. And this is what he had to say.
What concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president until I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there.
So a ringing endorsement for Vice President Harris, but he mixed up her name and called her Vice President Trump. But on the whole, he spoke in full sentences. He managed to collect his thoughts and sum up most of his points quite coherently. But he did seem to run out of steam towards the end of that press conference, totaling almost an hour. Just to highlight a couple of other things he said, when asked whether he was considering dropping out of the race, and he was asked that in various forms throughout that 1 hour, he said, I've just got to keep moving. I have more work to do. He also said, if I slow down, I can't get the job done. But he said there was no indications to that as of yet. And he said he would only reconsider if the polls all said that there was no way that he could win. And he said no polls were showing that. But if it's of course now what happens next, whether we see mass defections from within his party, whether he's done enough to win over Democrats who were slightly undecided. I think the next 48 hours or so will be critical. And now we're out the back of this NATO summit, we could potentially see lawmakers jumping on that bandwagon to say it's time for him to step aside, even though that was a much better performance than we were expecting from the press conference.
Right. Nick, we've heard questions from his own party. We've certainly heard questions from the media right there, including one reporter from Poland who talked about the concern of many people in Europe about potential Donald Trump presidency. Let's talk about international leaders. I mean, this press conference was ostensibly about NATO, about the importance of this international alliance and of importance of America's continuous leadership in the international community. Are the concerns that you and I are just talking about regarding Joe Biden, are they echoed by other international leaders?
Well, if you ask Joe Biden, if you ask the White House, they all say that those fears are not being echoed by the international community, by world leaders. In response to that question about whether they were concerned, he had to say that the allies were not saying, Joe, don't run. Instead, he said they were saying, you've got to win. He said they were worried that Trump would be, in his words, a disaster for that NATO alliance. The White House earlier said that they hadn't heard any concerns from world leaders about Biden's domestic political situation. But, of course, there were gaffes earlier in the day. You referenced a few moments ago that problem with President Zelensky. He spent some time with him during the course of the day, a couple of public events. And during one of them, he ended by introducing the president. But again, he mixed up names. This is what he said.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it.
So he tried to make light of that, but it was a very high-profile gaffe. And if you watch that video closely, you can see the other world leaders on the stage behind him, some of them wincing, some of them turning to each other at that very awkward moment. One of the questions in this press conference was, are other world leaders making excuses for you? And there were various world leaders backing President Biden during the course of today, including the president of Finland.
I've had the opportunity to speak to President Biden on many occasions during the past 48 hours. I have absolutely no concerns about the capacity of the current President of the United States to lead his country and to lead our fight for Ukraine and to lead NATO.
So the president of Finland has no concerns, but unfortunately there are many Democratic lawmakers within President Biden's own party who have plenty of concerns. We now have to wait and see whether that press conference did enough to allay their fears and stop them from saying he has to step aside in his re-election bid.
Nick, thank you so much for your time and your analysis tonight. That's journalist Nick Harper in Washington. And joining us again is Frank Sesno. Frank is a former CNN Washington bureau chief and a professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Frank, you watched along with us. When you and I spoke before this press conference, you talked about a list of concerns that basically Biden would have to address in order to allay the fears of the superdelegates, delegates, and of course, American voting public. Has he allayed those fears, in your opinion?
I doubt it. I mean, it was not a complete disaster by any means. As we just heard, it was a stronger performance than we've seen, certainly in the debate, and really stronger than the interview he did with George Stephanopoulos a few days ago. But when you're up against what Joe Biden is up against now, which is deep doubts among the donor class, among Democratic Party leaders, elected officials in the Senate and the House and elsewhere, it takes more than what we saw here tonight to turn that around. There were gaffes this evening. We've just heard about several of them. There were times when the president paused or hesitated or seemed like he got a little bit lost. He cited some names and statistics well. Others he seemed to be searching. So on the stylistic level, it wasn't a disaster, but it was not the performance of Joe Biden of 5 years ago. Substantively, he addressed a number of policy issues, or he tried to. Not all of them were clear-cut, straight line, but whether he was talking about NATO, whether he was talking about inflation, whether he was talking about the sort of global situation, the politics and competition between Russia, China, and that part of the world, and the United States and Europe and the other parts of the world, the president touched on some key elements, but it just was not the kind of performance that's going to lay to rest the deep concerns. So here's what's going to happen now. this news conference will be used in focus groups. We won't see those. This is going to happen behind the scenes. There will be polling, more private polling that will be done by the Democratic Party and others to see, what the dynamic is and what's moving. And there's going to be a lot of ears to the ground now that this NATO summit is over, up on the Hill and elsewhere. And we'll see whether any of those assessments get to Biden. But he was defiant tonight, and he said, unless somebody comes and tells me there's no way you can win, I'm not going anywhere.
Right. I noticed that defiance, at times he seemed almost short, certainly a little bit terse with some of the reporters, challenging them, saying, what are you talking about in terms of, me having to change my schedule and so on, and asking them to really specifically state what concerns they're talking about. He certainly seemed very good at pivoting, which, of course, is what politicians do, to international relations, which is one of his strengths. Do you feel that he has effectively addressed the questions that our colleagues, the reporters, have asked about his mental capacity, his physical health? Do you think he has?
Yeah. No, not really. I mean, he was asked several times about, how he would do in the room 2 or 3 years from now. He says, well, look at how I'm doing now. That doesn't address that issue. He was asked if he would have neurological testing. He said, well, if a doctor were to tell me, yeah, if there's a problem, I will, but I've met with my doctors and my doctors basically say I'm fine. What he did not do this evening is acknowledge the deep concerns that people have voiced and expressed about his performance, about his cognitive abilities. He didn't say, for example, I watched that debate again the other night where I was up there, and I would be like you. I would be very worried if I saw something like that. But let me explain. What he said was, well, with age comes wisdom. These are bumper stickers. They're not thorough, detailed, thoughtful responses that acknowledge the very real concerns. And you and I talked earlier about, is this a media thing? It's not the media. It's people in his party. It's a mass of voters across the country. We see this in poll after poll. This has existed for a long time. He just doesn't address that directly. And you can understand why, because you start getting in a tit for tat for that, and people will take it apart. They'll dispute certain elements if he tries to explain it, and then he gets lost, and now he sounds, it just, there are perils to it. Nonetheless, it's probably what he should do. If you are really addressing, if you're an airline or you're a car company and you have a crisis, the first thing you need to do is you acknowledge the crisis. And then you talk about how you're going to fix it. He has not acknowledged the crisis, and I don't think he will, but until and unless he does, this is going to remain a very open question and an open wound, I think.
Tell me, what are some of the things you're going to be looking out for in the days to come? Obviously, people are already commenting on social media. I saw Bruce Heyman, who is the former U.S. ambassador to Canada. He's saying that he deeply respects President Biden, had a great working relationship with him, respects his legacy, but he does think that it's time for him to step aside. Lots of reactions all over the map, really, coming in. What are the things you're going to be looking out for in the days to come?
Well, more comments like that, and where are they coming from? Probably the most influential indicator for the president, based on what he said, are these polls. Now, we also heard him say, don't pay any attention to the polls. He turned to the room and said, do you believe these polls? And that's typical. Presidents believe polls when they're up, and they don't believe them when they're down. But there are enough of them. And if they continue to come, he does not have a lot of time, by the way. If there's going to be a credible passing of the torch, so whoever takes it from here can do something with it, they need time. They need time to establish themselves, to put an organization together. So this is a very, very tricky moment. But what I'm looking for, what are some of the subsequent polls going to say? What do swing voters say? What do undecided voters say? As few of them as there are in this country right now. What do party leaders who've been being mum or read between the lines, what do they actually say now? This is more in sorrow than in anger. This is a very difficult thing for people to see, but it's crunch time. And so I do think we're going to start to see some more very significant comments and significant people speaking out in the coming days. And so that's what I'm going to be looking for, too.
Frank, thank you so much for your insights and your analysis tonight. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
That was Frank Sesno. Frank is a former CNN Washington bureau chief and a professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. And for more reaction to this high-stakes press conference, I want to bring in Democratic strategist Antoine Seawright. He joins me now from Charlotte, North Carolina. Antoine, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Antoine, you have steadfastly supported President Biden, even after his debate performance about 2 weeks ago. After tonight's press conference, how are you feeling? Has your opinion changed?
I'm Biden strong. I think had we seen this version of Joe Biden at the debate, there will be no discussions about who should be leading our country, who should be leading our party, and who's best positioned to help save democracy and freedom as we know them. This is Joe Biden's strength. If you want to answer the magical question that's floating around in the ecosystem, does he have a PhD in foreign policy? Then no. The answer is no. This is just wisdom, experience, all the things that he's criticized for coming through in real time while the world is watching. I was proud of Joe Biden tonight. Any reporter who doesn't have range or doesn't have depth and width with their reporting and may focus their attention on the few gaffes, they should know Joe Biden has been making gaffes throughout his entire career. However, if you look at the range and the depth and the width of his conversations around foreign policy, how they impact the current state of our country and how they impact the world in the future, you will not get a better candidate, you will not get a better person than Joe Biden, as he did tonight, laying out the stakes as a president, as the leader of the free world should do.
You're right. I mean, the man has called himself a gaffe machine at one point. That's what he called himself. So you're quite right in that this is not something new for us. Do you think, moving on from the reporters, there have also been a growing number of calls for him to step aside from some members of the Democratic Party, Democratic insiders. Do you think tonight will do anything to quell those doubters?
No, because in many ways, people had their minds made up before tonight. Tonight was just a vehicle for them to express themselves post tonight. And in many ways, people have had their minds made up since the debate. And that's okay. Look, I feel this way. I think politics, and I think I may have said this before on this program, politics is a relationship game. And so in a relationship, your partner adds value. And so they deserve the right to be heard. They certainly deserve the right to express themselves. It doesn't make them right. It doesn't make them wrong. It's just for a healthy relationship exists, you have to understand the needs, concerns, fears, hopes, aspirations, dreams of your partner. I think we should welcome that in our party. We pride ourselves on that. That does not mean a few voices in our party, no matter how loud they may be, determine the voices of the people. Elections are won and dictated by the people who show up in elections all across this country. The stakes are so high up and down that ballot in November. Certainly a July temperature check should not determine an election that's going to take place in November. All the polling we've seen indicates that this is still a toss-up race, a 50-50 jump ball, in spite of what the pundits and the politicians may say. And so I think Joe Biden has to stay the course. I think he has to keep focusing on the voters and keep meeting them where they are with a message that makes sense and remind folks about the threat that comes along with Donald Trump and Trumpism.
Antoine, thank you so much. I just want to ask you one quick question, and that is, I've been reading your op-eds and pieces you've written specifically about African American and Hispanic American voters and their continued loyalty to Joe Biden. After this press conference tonight, do you still feel that loyalty is there?
Absolutely. Black folks are loyal, consistent, dedicated, and the most consequential voting bloc in the history of this country. If there's one thing we do, we show up for our community, we show up for the Constitution, and we show up for this country. Election after election, in spite of the barriers that are sometimes and oftentimes put in front of us, the net worth and the network of the African-American voter continues to grow. Black people decided in record form that Joe Biden was going to be our nominee. We decided that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were going to be the president and the vice president. And to this point, the numbers indicate that black folks still think that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris should be reelected to the presidency and the vice presidency of the United States. You can't get more loyal than that.
Antoine, thank you so much for your time and your analysis. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was Democratic strategist Antoine Seawright. He joined us from Charlotte, North Carolina. And for more political reaction to this presidential press conference, I want to bring in Joe Walsh. Joe is a former U.S. congressman as well as a former Republican candidate for president. He joins us now from Washington. Joe, thank you so much for your time and your analysis tonight.
Good to be with you.
Joe, tell me, you are a never Trump Republican, and yet you did support Joe Biden up until his poor debate performance. I remember the interview you did the day after that debate with my colleague Natasha Fatah here at CBC News Network. Watching the conference tonight, did it change your view on Biden as a candidate?
Let me just make a slight correction, and you nailed it. I am a never Trumper. The only thing that matters is that Donald Trump is not reelected. Donald Trump is a threat to American democracy. I'll support whoever the nominee is. If Joe Biden stays in, I'm going to run through a freaking wall to help Biden win. Post-debate, I've been very public in I think Biden should step down because I really worry that he can't beat Donald Trump or isn't the strongest candidate who can beat Donald Trump. From the very beginning, Biden's had one issue. He's had to prove to the American people he's not too old, he's up to the job. 2 weeks ago tonight, he proved the exact opposite. So he had a nice press conference tonight, but I think it's still really up in the air as to whether he will be the nominee.
What are you hearing from political insiders? I mean, you know these guys from both sides, from, Republicans, Democrats. Do you feel that tonight's performance, which many people assessed as certainly much stronger than what we saw in the debate, is enough to allay those fears, especially from Democrats who are urging him to step aside?
No, and it's so fascinating. It's like when I came out against Donald Trump publicly 6 years ago, all of my former Republican colleagues would contact me privately and say that they agreed with what I was saying about Trump publicly, but they could never say it. The same thing is going on among Democrats now. Privately, if you took a private poll of Democrats in the House and the Senate, 95% of them wish that Joe Biden would pass the torch and step down. Most are afraid to say that publicly. But, 15 or so have said that publicly. I think more will come out and say that publicly tomorrow. And you're going to have a divided party. And we can't have a divided party if we want to defeat the threat to democracy. So this has got to end soon. This can't go on another week or two. And so it's either Biden or it's somebody else. Biden ultimately has to make that decision.
We just have you for just a little bit more time, Joe. If not Biden, obviously Vice President Kamala Harris is the name that is most frequently mentioned. What do you think about her chances of going up against Trump?
I think she'd kick Trump's, I'll watch my language, I think she would kick Trump's butt. Look, here's what I know, and I don't know a lot. Here's what I know. There are more people in America who oppose Trump than support him. Most Americans believe Trump is unfit. The problem right now is way too many Americans think that Biden is unfit because of his age. Kamala Harris, you may disagree with her on issues, and I'm not a Democrat. I disagree with her, but Kamala Harris is not unfit. So you run a candidate against Trump who is unfit, who most Americans don't like, with somebody energetic like Kamala Harris. Look, final thing, America can't stand this matchup, right? Every day, people I talk to publicly and privately, my God, Biden versus Trump. Come on, America, you can't do better than that. I think if you brought in somebody like Kamala Harris, it would inject such enthusiasm into this race. I think she'd kick Trump's butt.
Thank you so much for watching your language for us, Joe, and really appreciate having you with us tonight.
You got it.
That was Joe Walsh. Joe is a former U.S. congressman as well as a former Republican candidate for president. He joined us from Washington. And for more on that news conference, we want to go back to D.C. and our senior Washington correspondent, Paul Hunter. Paul, so much to unpack from that appearance. You've covered many elections in the U.S., here in Canada as well. What stood out for you?
That no matter what his intent, I guess, Joe Biden seems unable to not provide more material for his naysayers. Is that a triple negative? It might be. Look, before the news conference even began, late in the afternoon, he introduced Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as Vladimir Putin. Yes, he corrected himself quickly and he laughed about it. Joe Biden laughed. But, you know, on this day, at this event, at this time in Biden's political world, it's hard to ignore or see it as just another gaffe, right? Then the news conference starts an hour late. That stuff happens, so who knows if that signals anything. But then it begins, and very near the top, he calls Kamala Harris Vice President Trump. Let's give a listen.
What concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start.
Right? So there's your proverbial viral clip. That is what people will remember from this. Democrats, undecided voters, Trump backers. There's your clip. A complicating factor is that Joe Biden then also kind of settled down. He gave detailed answers on the Middle East, for example. Talked about the U.S. economy on his watch and the positives inherent in that. He talked about his presidency and the kinds of things that he's achieved. It's a decent list, right? By most nonpartisan measures. Inflation's finally coming down. He's got a track record that in any other cycle would make re-election a slam dunk, especially running against a candidate with the kind of negatives that Donald Trump has. But, the gaffes, right? Are they gaffes or are they signals he's losing his mental acuity? Ask George Clooney, right? Ask the 14 Democrats who now call for him to step back. Ask Vice President Trump, as Biden put it. But as I say, he talked on other issues. It seemed like a president. Here he is on guns, for example, and using this issue to do what many of his critics say he hasn't been doing, and that is to take on Trump directly. Here's the guns clip.
The idea we're sitting around, this is where Kamala's so good as well. We're sitting around. More children are killed by a bullet than any other cause of death. The United States of America. What the hell are we doing? What are we doing? We got a candidate saying, promise the NRA, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to do anything. You got a Supreme Court that is what you might call the most conservative court in American history. This is ridiculous. There's so much we can do still, and I'm determined to get it done.
So which one's Joe Biden, right? That's the question for so many, right? Is it the Vice President Trump, as he put it, Joe Biden, or is it that one that we just heard? At the end of the press news conference, he reiterated he's in this for the long run. He's not going anywhere. And again, that he's best suited for the job. In his view, the only reason he'd go, he said, is if someone told him there's no way he could win. And he said no one's saying that to him.
And he said that quite a few times. Incomparable insights by CBC's Paul Hunter. Thank you so much, Paul. Our next guest is a Democrat who has been calling the U.S. President Joe Biden to step down. Johanna Maska is a former White House Director of Press Advance for President Barack Obama. She had stepped out of the Washington NATO summit to speak with us. Johanna, thank you so much for making time for us tonight. What did you make of President Biden's performance at this crucial press conference today?
Yeah. Well, today's the first time I've seen him in a very long time. Myself, I was there at that press conference. And it was interesting because, you know, he came in, I watched both the Ukraine event and this press conference, and he came in with more energy than I expected, especially given the grueling schedule. But I think the White House said something right this morning. They said, it really doesn't matter what happens today. It's not going to change those who have made up his mind that that he should resign. And it's not going to change those who have made up their mind that he should stay. And that's probably the truth. Look, I believe we should pass the torch. And President Biden said, actually, I know I'm the best to govern. I think I'm the best to win. And he said that if he was shown that there was no way he could win, then he would pass the torch. Like, that's very important because he's a team player. And I am so grateful to Joe Biden for bringing us back from Donald Trump, who really did not care about NATO or our security alliances that have kept us safe since World War II. I'm so grateful to him for bringing down inflation from the king of bankruptcy, who was our president for too long. And we do not need to go back to that. But those of us who are calling on him to pass the torch are doing it out of love, because we are talking to the people who are the voters who are debating what they're going to do next, because they didn't think he could serve when they watched that debate. I think there are a lot of people around him who also know and trust that he will make the right decision. And that was very reassuring tonight. I'm sorry, they're breaking down NATO. So you guys are seeing everybody kind of walk past me. But here it is. It has been an interesting press conference from, of course, Trudeau decided to go out on a run, and and Biden took some questions tonight.
I love that we're just watching politics unfolding in real time by just watching the scene behind you, Johanna. We're going to quickly run out of time here. I want to bring up a few of the things he said and ask you whether there's, am I reading too much significance into this? He's said, you mentioned VP Harris would be ready to serve from day one. That's what one of the reporters reminded him. And he said, absolutely, I did say that. And then what you just hit on, tomorrow if I show up at the convention and people say they want someone else, I will step aside. And then he said, it won't happen. Yes. Do you see these very small, very gentle indications as an indication that he's perhaps less staunch in his desire to stay on than he was a week ago?
No one knows politics like Joe Biden. You know, he knows, he's been in the game for a very long time, and no one wants to be a lame duck, because when you are a lame duck, you are unable to really push for some of the changes that you need to make. So I am certain that behind the scenes, a conversation is going on that's different than in front of the scenes. And that's, you know, because he is such a team player to the Democrats, because he did bring us back from Donald Trump, who never should have had that office. He drove inflation. He drove us into a situation that was untenable, and we had to pull ourselves out of that. So I'm thankful to him. He knows politics. He'll do the right thing. I think he's showing us that.
Johanna, thank you so much for your time and your analysis, but you have not changed your mind tonight, have you?
No, I haven't changed my mind. And I have to say, if we had a full open convention, if he decided to announce that next Monday at the LBJ Library, if we had a full open convention, everyone would be watching the Democratic convention. And that is exactly what we need, because we have the ideas and the Republicans do not.
Johanna, thank you so much for your time and your analysis as we're watching the NATO summit unfolding or tearing down behind you. Thank you so much, Johanna. Johanna Maska is a former White House Director of Press Advance for President Barack Obama.